All right, time for the finale. I think almost certain we'll make this the last webinar in this series, and then of course we can, excellent. And then of course we can address anything further. If there's questions that people post in YouTube or here, then we can have a separate Q&A in addition to whatever Q&A we do here if we need to. Anyhow, let's go to the, welcome everyone. And let's go to the slides to start with, and then I'll come back. If you have any questions, you can also put them in, and I'll get to them in a little bit. Okay, just to remind us of where we're at, there's going to be pretty much 4 concepts as part of this series that will come together to give us a sense of how to know that God exists and what the basic nature of God is. We've touched on the first 3 here, consciousness screen, and then reasons and causes is a big one. And I'm going to do a little bit more right now. I'll address like Bertrand Russell's quote and so forth, which I'll get to in a second here. And then we talked about goodness. I'll brush up on that. And then we just want to understand the idea of infinite, unlimited, could there be multiple gods, things like that. This also touches a bit between goodness and infinite. It touches on the main practical objection people tend to have to belief in God is the idea, of course, is, you know, if God's all powerful, then why is there, and good, then why is there evil? Again, I've already touched on that or even gone into pretty decent depth on that, but we'll just kind of make sure that that's clear if there's any questions about it. So let's begin here by finishing up a little bit with reasons and causes. On this slide I wrote, so there's this kind of question. What's because the kind of practical objection that people have to believing in God is the question of evil, right? Combined with what if God's all powerful and evil, like I said. And then there's sort of a philosophical objection that's also out there kind of somewhat commonly, which is something to do with, there's all kinds of degrees of sophistication, right? I had one person say to me, well, why can't it all be a circle, right? That's not very sophisticated, it's kind of vague, right? You can kind of ask an unlimited number of confusing, vague questions to kind of infinitely filibuster, right? Like if someone was kind of discussing with me, right, or whatever, but I could kind of deal with each of those in turn, right? But if we understand what kind of underlies the structure of most any question about God's existence, it basically it comes down to, well, why does it have to be God, right? Or people might kind of preemptively say something that ends up being having a similar being of a similar kind of root, which is well, it depends how you define God, right? If you, not after all my webinars, they wouldn't necessarily say that, but you know, early on, if you're talking to someone, right, they'll be like, well, you know, it depends how you define God. Well, this is why I've taken time. Let me just move this back a little bit. This is why I've taken time, and what we've really done in this series is get underneath how people think and kind of rebuilt it properly, at least a kind of quick version of rebuilding it properly. And then I spend time, you know, constantly with my different webinars and the things that I talk about with lawful implication to go into more depth. But it turns out it does not matter how you quote unquote define God. That question, to ask any question is fine, right? But the content of the question ultimately ends up being misguided. What we've done in this series is we've shown how we first understand the concept of consciousness screen and how we, of course, need to begin there. Just like a metaphor that's similar to what I've talked about in the past, but that we can use in this discussion here is, and that touches on things related to this, is these days, since the internet, there used to be, when I would get a computer game, there would be this nice instruction book, and I would enjoy reading the instruction book personally before playing the game. It would be kind of fun. I might even go get something to eat and read it, and it would be kind of a fun anticipation of playing the game. Since the internet, and since they make a zillion patches and they tend to release games before they're finished and so forth these days, so there's never really a time to make an instruction book because they're always tweaking the game and changing things. And so there's not really a lot of instruction books even online these days. It tends to be more like various YouTube videos that people make, and some kind of in-game tutorial that often doesn't. There's a ton to maybe figure out in a game, right? So let's imagine that you, me, and some friends are investigating a game like that we're playing. We have some sense of it, basic sense of it, but we're trying to figure out how things work in it. Oh, how does agility affect our attack speed? Or if I have more attack speed, is that better than having more strength? Let's test it. Let's increase our strength by 20 and see how much damage we do in 1 minute to like a dummy that might be in the game where you can see the damage in some way. Or you try to figure out some way to measure how much damage you're doing if you have 20 strength versus if you have 20 agility, right? If strength increases your damage, if agility increases your this attack speed of a character. And then, so you're trying to use the scientific method, right? You're trying to basically discover about that computer game world, right? And it's appropriate in that case to use what amounts to the scientific method, right? To try to be rigorous, to and measure things carefully, and so on and so forth, right? With you don't need a double-blind study in the case of that. In the case of measuring damage with strength versus agility, but you need a similar type of rigorous thing that's appropriate for that situation, right? In other situations in life or wherever, you would want like a double-blind study if there's some kind of placebo effect or whatever. So there's a discovery process, which that kind of helps us understand what we want to do with the scientific method, and also if something doesn't seem to fit, or if there's an anomaly or whatever, we don't just want to wave our hand and say, oh, that must be a bug, or maybe that's intentional. Maybe we're misunderstanding it. Maybe there's something that we need to delve into. There's something to discover. Who knows, right? So there is, as part of the method, I agree, we don't want to go straight to, oh, God did it. Oh, it was a miracle. Oh, that's a glitch, or an interference by the person making the game, or whatever, right? So in that way, you want to assume that things are uniform and so forth. But if we were playing the game, if I were to say, let's just assume that nobody made this game, then that wouldn't actually help us to discover the game. It would be irrelevant and nonsensical to think about things that way. That doesn't directly address this. I just want to have that'll kind of what I just said is relevant in general to a discussion about God, and then I think it's going to come into play as I talk about things here and there, right? So the overall objection we're taking a look at here is a question about cause. Oh, I was talking about defining God, right? Instead, I started talking about that also because of the screen. So if we were trying to discover about the game, then everything would start with what's on our screen, each of us, right? That's the only thing we're looking at. And then we have to discover from there, right? And not having any concept that that's going on, that might be a problem. So similarly in life, or if we take one more step with a metaphor, and if it wasn't on a computer screen, but it was a virtual reality setup where it felt more real, right? More three-dimensional and so forth, where we were, whatever it feels like when you're doing a virtual reality setup, depending on how extensive it is and such. Then it would be the same type of thing. Instead of feeling like you're looking at a computer screen, you feel like you're looking at a world more normal, what feels like normal to look around in the world. Like you might be able to turn your head and things change and so forth, but you'll have like virtual reality goggles on, I assume, and maybe you have something on your hands that can affect touch if it's really sophisticated. I haven't used the most sophisticated gear. I don't know how far the actual technology goes currently or whatever. But it's easy to imagine as a thought experiment, right, of it being pretty good. where it would be the same type of thing as a computer screen, except that instead of it looking like a computer screen, it looks like it's all around us, and that we could even feel it and so forth, right, with our hands, perhaps, if there was something on our hands. And of course, even with a computer game, there's not just visual, there's sound, right? All of that is a metaphor that can help us understand the idea of a consciousness screen. That's what we're dealing with in real life. So everything starts there. So when we talk about cause, like whenever we're trying to understand about God and whether God exists, we're always going to need to address the issue of cause, pretty much, right? So I'm not giving like exactly the first cause argument, but I'm talking about cause because it's very relevant and generally just speaking about God. I guess you can there might be attempts at proof of God that don't really touch on cause, like C.S. Lewis did one that had to do with this kind of his idea of a shared morality of someone, no matter what culture they were from, and trying to use that to prove God, which to me doesn't really work well. But anyhow, we built the idea of consciousness screen as a concept, right? The consciousness screen exists. We just kind of built the distinction of it to refer to it with a word. Once we do that, then we can, then we took a look at, I'll go to this slide here. It just says reasons and causes and so forth. Then we just need to understand that things happen for a reason. And I don't mean a choreographed reason. Like often people say, oh, I believe things happen for a reason. They're talking about God or the universe or something is like choreographing things, right? So that things balance out, or so that there's justice or karma or whatever. So that's not what I mean when I say things happen for a reason. What I mean is the exact opposite of things happening in your consciousness screen for literally no reason. And I talk about the punch in the face idea, right? If someone punches you in the face or whatever, then the idea that sense, that overall experience came into your conscious screen for no reason whatsoever. It's not connected to someone actually punching in the face. It's not connected to anything, right? We went into this. If you think through what it would actually mean for like the pixels in your conscious screen, so to speak, to configure themselves in the way that they are for no reason ever, even if, right, if some of that happened for no reason, then there'd still be something or something able to decide what was going to happen for no reason, if you think it through. So it turns out that either absolutely everything in your conscious screen has to be utter chaos, utterly happening for no reason, which would make any decision, any action, any justification, everything would go out the window. Rape would be completely fine. It wouldn't exist. There'd be no such thing. You couldn't affect anyone else's conscious screen. You couldn't affect your own conscious screen if things could happen for no reason. So we can understand that, and we just totally take this for granted every moment of our lives before thinking philosophically, before thinking about God. Just all of us all the time are thinking and behaving necessarily, and for good reason, that there's a reason why things happen in our conscious screen, even if we don't know what those reasons are. And there isn't one reason. There's a whole bunch of inputs, right? The reason why anything happens in a computer game, is a whole bunch of factors, right? There's inputs on the board, on the keyboard that you put in. There's the code of the game. Then there's the configuration of what's going on right now when you're playing the game. There's the physics engine, right, which part of the code of the game, and so forth. So all the factors get put together, and then you get a result, right? So in that sense, things don't happen like for a reason, right? There's a whole bunch of factors that go together and result in the exact configuration of your conscious screen and everyone else's. We completely take that for granted, and it's correct. It must be the case, right? That's the basis of getting it when it comes to God. And then there's the critical ideas of goodness and infinite that we want to finish up with. But I needed to review that as we come into, well, why does it have to be God? Or why can't the universe cause things? Or why can't evolution cause things? Or why can't if someone's just being kind of make a point, they could say, well, why can't it be a carrot or the Easter Bunny? or why can't it all be a circle, like the person said, right? Or why can't it like stretch back to infinity, right? Or things like that. Well, for starters, we want to build based on what we know and be simple and clear. And so the simple correct answer, the simple starting answer is, given that the things are happening, given that the consciousness screen exists, that it could be other than the way it is. And on top of that, it's being configured for reasons, complex, reasons, but clearly reasons. Every instant, every change in your consciousness screen is happening for a set of complex reasons, and it could be different, right? And it's there. So something has to be capable of making it, and making it for all the reasons that go into why it is the way it is. And we are then building, we're saying that, or I'm saying that's what God is. And God doesn't have any other qualities yet. I'm building the definition of what I mean by God, but I'm also not making a definition that doesn't completely fit into the bare bones of what everyone would like. The minute I say there has to be something capable of making everyone's consciousness screen, then actually it turns out there's one thing I'll just say for that, by using any word there, like being or whatever, then I kind of end up importing a little bit of meaning perhaps. So remember, the only meaning so far of God as I'm talking is just what we've built, which is something capable of, and actually doing so, of making consciousness screens for everyone. And that means continuing to make consciousness screens every moment. Right, so God couldn't just put things in motion, so to speak. It couldn't be like a prime mover or a first cause. God's actually must cause your consciousness screen to be made the way it is constantly every second, just like, not just like, but of course somewhat analogous to a computer having to continuously make what's on the screen, right? Your computer can't get things started and just start putting something on the screen and then let it go, right? The computer has to keep on processing, right? You can't unplug your computer or turn it off and have your computer screen just keep on playing a game or something like that, right? That's a metaphor. It's not exactly the same as God, but that element of it is the same. And that's important, right? Because I'm not making like a first cause argument. I'm just not making any argument whatsoever. I'm trying to build critical building blocks so we understand. So once we build things properly, then we basically keep from needing to play whack-a-mole with the new flavor of the day or whatever, with why couldn't it be such and such. And of course the major one is some form of like the universe, or maybe like a force. Like when we talk about a force, people say, well, why does God need to be conscious? Well, again, I preempt that stuff in terms of, I basically preempt that misunderstanding by having understanding, right? It's not that I'm overcoming an objection in advance, but I'm helping people have the right basis to not have that misunderstanding. Because if something's making a consciousness screen for reasons, it's making everyone's consciousness screen for all the reasons that, right, the reasons of the physical world, right, which is made up of reasons, made up of code, right? So the world can't do it itself, right? But the world itself isn't self-existent. It can't cause things, but it does the external world, the physical world, so to speak. It doesn't exist in the way people think, but it fully exists in the sense of a whole set of reasons and constants and so forth, physical laws, right? Physical laws can't do anything. They are constants that God follows, right? They're regularities in how God does things or upholds the world as it currently. Like gravity doesn't make things fall. In essence, God makes your consciousness screen. In your consciousness screen, it appears that things fall. But gravity really exists as a reason, right? As a regularity in the universe. The universe itself is code, made of code, so to speak. saying made of code is a little bit of a metaphor, but it's about as close as I can get to saying what's going on. So now if we say, well, why can't it be the universe, the Easter Bunny, Superman, Gandalf? Why can't Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings create the world? People might say, well, Gandalf doesn't exist, right? Well, Gandalf does exist, right? The Wizard and Lord of the Rings trilogy. Superman does exist as in the way that it does, right? Like we wouldn't want to say that Superman doesn't exist at all, right? Superman exists as a fictional character. We can say lots of things about the qualities of Superman, right? He's in the DC universe and laser vision and flies and so forth. But Superman doesn't exist, and that Superman can cause things outside of the realm in which Superman lives, so to speak, right? Exists, right? So inside of a story, Superman can do stuff and cause stuff. Outside of the story, Superman can't. And it's essentially the same with the universe or the Easter Bunny or anything. Furthermore, to say something like, well, why can't God be the Easter Bunny? Or why can't God be the universe? Well, God for this discussion is exactly what I said, which is the definition is the thing that's creating everyone's consciousness field, right, for the reasons. I don't need to use the word God for that, but clearly in terms of just talking and thinking and in English, right, then God is the obviously appropriate term for that thing. Now, the separate question is, well, does God need to be conscious? And that's just a matter of clear thought and then knowing how to do that. Once again, we look at the opposite. We get back into absurdity if we think, well, okay, there's a thing, whatever that might be, and it's making everyone else's consciousness fields for reasons, and it's not conscious. And that's just like, what, right? Something that's not conscious can't deal with anything on the level of consciousness, right? And so to create something that's conscious, to create consciousness fields, you pretty obviously need to be conscious. And I really don't have much more to say about that. You just have to kind of, I mean, if in the future people, like if it's a genuine sticking point for somebody, but you just think it through, like on your own. And whether or not God is conscious, and absolutely God is conscious, is more bears upon the concept of goodness, right, and purpose, and and so forth. So it's important for that reason. Let's see. So I think it's extremely clear that something has to be conscious. There's just no sense to saying there's a bump on a log, there's a dot, and the only qualities of the dot is that it has no qualities. It's not conscious. It's not aware of anything whatsoever, and yet somehow I'm saying it's creating something else. Anything, whether or not it's a consciousness screen or whatever, right? But in a sense, the only things that exist, remember, are I have this here. Are there's conscious screens. That's what we're aware of. That's what we build everything off of. Reasons don't exist in and of themselves, right? Neither do contingent beings that are aware of consciousness screens, because they need their consciousness screen basically to exist. And so you have God. And so the only thing causing anything is God here. Reasons don't like make stuff. There are reasons why God causes what God causes specifically. Let's look at Bertrand Russell's quote. So this guy is, supposed to be a good philosopher, managed to get famous and so forth. And bizarrely, This is kind of, one of his things, or the kind of main thing that gets quoted. So the idea is, if everything must have a cause, and what's going to happen, and what you can kind of be aware of in general, is if you come to an absurd conclusion using correct reasoning, then what does that mean? It means your premise is off. There's a flaw in your premise. There's a flaw in this premise. It's not true that everything must have a cause. But this is what happens when people try to think without realizing to base their thinking and their understanding of reality on consciousness screens. Once you start thinking there's a physical universe out there that like does stuff, right? Rather than it exists as in essence, like a metaphor in our minds, but then also as code or reasons why God does stuff, right? And there's no universe out there any more than Superman exists, right? We can imagine Superman existing. We can talk coherently about Superman, but Superman exists as in essence, like a metaphor or like a mental construct, right? So, okay, if everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause, right? So the conclusion correctly flows from the premise, but the premise is incorrect. If there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God, right? So, and so again, he gets it confused here. If we do it the way I did it, then there's a consciousness screen. The conscious screen can be the way it is for reasons or not, since it has to be reasons, right? And since it could not exist, and it could exist other than how it is, something is making it and continues to make it. That something, we just exists. We just figured that out from it. We know that we derive that something has to exist, right? So we could put any word to that, but God is the obvious word to put with that. The world is similar to saying, well, it could just as well be Superman as God. Right? Superman is not the appropriate word for being or something. I've already defined being as something that's aware of their conscious screen, that's kind of contingent. So I don't want to use the word being even for God. Okay, so because I don't want to import assumptions by accident, right, into the way God is. So if someone could get confused and say, well, is God a being? You don't need to ask questions. You can investigate things like that if you do it carefully, but that's kind of a pointless dead end, or maybe it isn't. I mean, you can think it through if you want, but it's not necessarily relevant, because God is something that's unique, that's creating everyone's consciousness screen. I've repeated that over and over, but that's what God is. So if someone wants to try and say that an appropriate word for that thing that's doing that is Superman or the Easter Bunny or the world, then they could just say that, but I don't really have a lot of answer to that if they really think that those words are appropriate. Right? I wouldn't call that thing a carrot. I wouldn't call it I wouldn't say there's no word for it, there's no concept of it. I would say, well, obviously we're talking about God, and so just basically everyone else, right? People quickly get that, all right, if there's such a thing that is aware and intentional, and it's going to turn out, all powerful, all knowing, good, and is making everyone's consciousness screen at all times, then yeah, okay, that's God. It's not the world, and it's not something else. And then the quote goes on to say, so there cannot be any validity in that argument. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. Sure. Right. Well, that's good, because that gets to the idea of infinite or infinity. So let's talk about that. And again, things don't need to have a beginning. This is blurry thinking, right? He correctly reasons from flawed premises here and there. So he kind of flits in and out of coherent thought, but everyone has to be this way until and unless they have the right basis. It's not his fault. It's just odd that he's, famous and thought to be smart in this way. He might be smart in other ways. He might be way better at mathematics than someone else like myself, but he's not good at this. So yeah, a poverty of imagination that things must have a beginning. We don't need to worry about whether our consciousness screen has a beginning. It simply is right now. We can We can stop and be aware of it right this moment, and it's there right now. It doesn't matter whether it has a beginning. It's being created right now, and oop, it got created again, and oh my, it got created again, right? Because it keeps moving and changing. So that means it's, the computer's running, so to speak. God's not a computer, but like God keeps making the consciousness. It's not relevant about beginning, but we can separately understand if we understand about infinite. So let's do that. Because I've already touched on goodness, I can circle back around and make sure it's clear. So, okay. The basic idea here is there are inherently contradictory concepts, and those concepts can't exist. They're just a phrase or a set of words that refer to like two mutually exclusive things. Cold fire is not a contradiction. It's just like an imaginary thing that doesn't conform to physical reality, likely, right? However, like a married bachelor would be an inherent contradiction. It can't exist. God cannot create a married bachelor because there's no such thing. It's just a phrase that contains two inherently contradictory concepts, right? Someone that's married and someone that's not married. That's not a limitation on God. That's not a limitation on God's omnipotence. It's just a nonsense phrase. It's like if someone says, "Can God create a Bajuga Baba?" Right? God could create something, and any of us, including God, could call it a Bajuga Baba, right? But if there's no such thing as a Bajuga Baba, then no, God can't create it in that sense. Can God make a stone that's too big for God to lift? No. It's not a deep question. The answer is just simple, no. So you can, if you play around with words enough, then you can get rid of a contradiction by changing like the meanings, by equivocating, by changing the meanings of what the words kind of plainly or should mean or whatever. So if I somehow redefine bachelor to mean something other than someone who is not currently married, right? Then yeah, you could have a married bachelor. I just redefine the word, right? I equivocated. But if it's just the simple plain meaning, if we're not playing games, basically, if we're being careful or simple, but not simplistic, then if there's no trick, then it can't, both be, the sidewalk can't both be wet and not be wet at the same time, unless you jiggle with the meanings of the words, right? So you can always play word games, but when if there's a careful, clear, inherent contradiction, then it can't refer to anything if it's like a phrase that's like married bachelor. Okay, so infinite amount is one of those things where it is like married bachelor. It cannot exist. God cannot write down all of the whole numbers, right? I think the whole numbers are 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. I think whole means they include 0. I think natural numbers is like not without the 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. If I have my terminology right. But God can't write down all those numbers, okay? Any unbounded set, even God, you can't write them down, I can't write them down, neither can God. Can't currently be looking at all the whole numbers. And people say, well, God's infinite, God can do that. You just don't understand, David. No, I do understand. And such a thing, there's no such thing as, if you have an amount, you're limited, you're defined. Infinite means not limited. Now there's such a thing as infinite, right? The set of whole numbers is infinite, it's unbounded. It can go on forever in theory, right? Again, 0, 1, 2, 3, ... right? It's infinite. God's power is infinite. There's no limits on it. And I'll explain why in a moment. But that at least as a concept is conceivable. It can be. But God cannot have an infinite amount of power. That phrase basically means omnipotent. So which is kind of like an equivocation, right? So if we're just using infinite amount mistakenly as a synonym for infinite, like omnipotent, like infinite amount of power, then yes, once again, if we change the meaning of the phrase, or we mess around with a meaning to just mean infinite, and we just kind of get rid of the word amount, basically conceptually, then yeah, God has an infinite amount of power if infinite amount is a synonym for infinite, and the word amount just kind of drops off. But you can't have an infinite amount of anything if amount means specified, right? Actual, defined. There are not an infinite amount of stars. God could, in theory, create more and more stars without limit, right? But currently, there exists a finite number of stars. Any number is finite. There's no such thing also as an infinite number. There's such a thing as an unbounded series, like I said, like the whole numbers. But there's not such a thing as an infinite number of something, if by infinite number, we mean anything like actually existing, bounded, defined, right? Number basically means defined, a number of something. So there's not an infinite number of stars because there's no such thing as an infinite number of anything. And so this has a number of ramifications. One is there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. There's only one cause of everything anyway, in essence. Like when you understand how everything works, God's actually the only cause, right? Aristotle didn't have it right when there was like all these different types of causes, right? Like a formal cause and a material cause and so on and so forth. Once we understand the universe composed of reasons, then everything can make sense. The definitions of our words can make sense and so forth. The existence and nature of mental objects and everything falls into place properly. So, and it all becomes fairly clear and simple. But when people don't have that, understandably, they're just going to spout nonsense and they can't help it. And if they publish a lot of papers, they might think that they're smart and be arrogant, you know, and so forth. But it's all nonsense. It's all futile until and unless you understand that. So you're, you know, ahead of any supposed philosopher or PhD in philosophy and so forth if you have this stuff. They're like in pre-K compared to you, pre-kindergarten. Okay, so could there be like multiple gods? Well, suppose there were multiple beings that were all, or multiple, it's kind of an accident if I use the word beings, and multiple godlike things that, let's say gods, right? If there were multiple gods, I don't need a word other than God for God. Like I don't need like a type word for God, like being, right? We could just think of God as God and not have a separate type, like is God a such and such. God's unique, it's going to turn out. And so we could just use God and we don't, again, need a type, right? If there's like an animal where it's its own type and there's nothing similar, we wouldn't need to have a whole bunch of types that it was. It could just be itself, right? So, but let's say, could there be a whole bunch of gods? An infinite number of gods? No, but could there be several gods? Well, if these several gods had a disagreement, then we would find out pretty quickly who was stronger, right? Now, a couple things. So if let's say there's 10 gods, just to pick a number, right? There can't be an infinite number of gods because there can't be an infinite number of anything. So if there can't be no God because something's creating our consciousness. So could there be some number of gods other than one? Is the question here. So let's just pick a number 10 just for this, just to talk. If the sum total of power of all those gods was finite, right? Like if then, or if it was finite, then that doesn't make any sense because finite means bounded, it means limited. But if the God's power was, if the 10 gods power, I could have started with one God. If God's power this same reasoning applies either way. If God's power is limited, then there has to be something else that's limiting God with power, right? We couldn't say there's nothing limiting God. To say that nothing is limiting God means God's power is unlimited or not limited, right? We just said that. We just said God's power is not limited. That means God's power is not limited. That's just basic consistency of thinking, which, as I pointed out before, that's what logic is, or done correctly, that's what logic is. So God's power to be limited would have to be limited by something. So maybe some other God, right? But there can't be an infinite number of gods. So let's say there's 10 gods. Well, those 10 gods combined can't have limited power, because that means there'd be an 11th God, which we just said there wasn't, right? Who was limiting the power of the other 10 gods. You see? So whether there's one, it's going to turn out that there's one, but just as I'm continuing here, whether or not there's one God or 10 gods or however many gods, collectively their power has to be unlimited. Because again, once we decide, okay, that's all the gods there are, pick a number, right? Then nothing could be limiting those gods. It would be like one more God. And it can't go on forever, because there can't be such thing as an infinite number of anything. So if of these 10 gods, collectively they were unlimited in power, well, the minute they disagreed about any one pixel in someone's consciousness screen, then you'd find out which one was stronger than the other, right? So one of them is going to be unlimited. Remember that collectively they have to have unlimited power. We just covered that over and over, right? So that means the strongest one is the one with unlimited power, which means the other ones don't have any power. Like if they had power, right, that couldn't be stopped by the stronger one, then again, it doesn't make any sense, right? It contradicts what we said, where that would be a limit on the other god's power. So we'd find out which one is the one with unlimited power real quick, the minute they disagree. So you could have like 10 gods who operated in perfect harmony, at which point they're basically one anyway, right? You're back at one God, essentially, right? There wouldn't be, they'd literally be in perfect harmony at all times, right? So again, now we're back to one. And at that point, if someone wants to quibble, that's fine. If you want to say there could be 10 gods that are all exactly in harmony, identical, doing the exact same thing, then that's fine. It amounts to one God. Doesn't matter to me. There might be some reasoning that further clarifies that for someone that, but I don't know anyone that actually thinks that for real, and it doesn't matter as far as I can tell. But if someone just feels like it does matter and wants to try to figure out an even more clear explanation of that, that's fine. But I've explained the concept. So can't be zero gods, then there wouldn't be any consciousness screen. Can't be infinite amount of anything, and I'll ask people if they have any questions about that in a moment in the chat. And then if you're down to just a specified number of gods, then it turns out there needs to be one that's all powerful, and then that's really the only one. Right, if one is all powerful and causes everything at every moment, then if you're like, well, could there be other ones that are limited in power and they just go do stuff? Well, again, their power is fully at the pleasure of the one that has all the power. So they can't have, the only free will or ability to do anything would be given to them by God, and then God would literally have to give it to them every moment. So God would always be choosing the exact limits and scope of their power or freedom of choice at every moment, which is what God does with us. You see? But in terms of being able to create consciousness screens directly, then there's no difference. Once again, they have to be operating in perfect harmony, because none of them can actually override God. And God has to be creating the consciousness screen. So if God creates other things that supposedly can create consciousness screens, then God would be deciding the exact limits of what they could do for every instance of every consciousness screen, which boils down to God's making the consciousness screen, right, for reasons. So there can be all kinds of reasons that go into making consciousness screens, but you're constantly, every way you look at it, you're going to come back down to one God, one creator of consciousness screens that has no limits on God's power, no actual limits. There's no actual thing that can also affect consciousness screens that has power over God, is what unlimited power means. And once we think of it in terms of consciousness screens, then we can see that God's not like limited by the amount of molecules or wheat that there is, right? Like, or right, like the amount of oil is not limited to God, right? Because oil is just it's like an author, right? Or someone making a movie. There's no limit on how much water there is for them to have in their world, right? Because it's a movie. They're creating it, right? They're the writer or producer or whatever, right? So they can add as much water as they want. Like imagine you're making a movie and they say, well, okay, this city is going to flood. And someone else says, well, there's not enough water for it to flood. Now they could mean that within the story, it doesn't flow from the logic of the story that there's enough water. But if they meant, no, there's just not actually enough water, they'd say, what are you talking about? We're writing the story. That doesn't make any sense. I mentioned that God, as you understand this, all of this, you can see that God can't have whims, right? A whim is like something just comes into God's mind, so to speak, or God's awareness. I don't know exactly what it's like to be God. Okay. So someone says, well, if someone asks, well, what's the mind of God like? Well, I don't know. I know we know some things about it. We know that whatever it is, it's capable of processing all the reasons, and it's not a mind in the sense that it interfaces like we're used to, right? Like using metaphors from ourselves can break down at times. Sometimes they can really help. There's some aspects of God we can fully understand, and I don't know exactly what it's like to be God. I don't know what it's like to start creating stuff or etc. I don't know, metaphorically speaking, exactly how the mind of God operates or something, right? It's unlimited, but again, God's not aware of all the whole numbers. Anything that would be infinite in amount, God can't be aware of, because there's no such thing as it actually existing. So if there's an infinite amount of the future, then God can't be aware of the future. God could decide, I'm going to do such and such in the future, or at this time, or when other things line up, or however you think of the future. But God can't, to the extent that the future is an unlimited and an infinite amount of stuff, or would be, in terms of all the future or all the possible futures, God can't actually be aware of anything that's an infinite amount. So something can be not limited, like God, and exist, but something can't be both defined and limited, and defined and unlimited at the same time. Something can't be an amount and be unlimited at the same time. So God can't have whims. God can't, and about any of these topics, I could theoretically go on forever with every possible confusion, right? But at some point, I try to describe things, fairly well, and then if confusions come up, I can address them in an ongoing way in the future. God can't be deceived, right? Which is important. So in order to wish actual bad on people, then you need to be deceived. Now, there is bad in the world. So wait, God's all powerful, but we talked about this already. You can kind of, though I can kind of do a quick overview here. to have the possibility of abundance, which is like more is more, which is like basically comes down to love. Like if we have the ability to care about other people, or love them, or like sacrifice something for ourselves, of our resources in order for them to have a better valued experience, or for at least our in our limited understanding that we think that'll happen, and so we do it. That can lead to more overall goodness, because now you don't just have your own goodness, you have other people's goodness that can then add to your own sense of goodness. To make that, God had to make the possibility of less is less, of waste. And so God made the possibility of bad, in a sense, and currently it exists, right? Bad is not just possible, but it exists. So we want to seek to understand, as we ended last time, the root of our free will comes down to not agreeing, rubber stamping, whatever, that that bad is good. That bad is ultimately necessary. Don't confuse that with like saying, oh, I'm not going to go exercise because I don't feel like it, right? Or I'm not going to go do this thing that I need to do for whatever because I don't feel like it. That's different, right? What we want to do is resolve the I don't know if it's exactly a contradiction, but the conflict between what might be good later versus what feels good now, or what we feel like doing. Right? We like to kind of get our ideas and our beliefs and so forth aligned about the world and what we feel like doing and what we like and so forth. So if God's not deceived, then that's great news, and when we understand goodness, because God wants goodness for everybody. We can also be aware of something fascinating and maybe hard-hitting, which is that God is aware of everyone's consciousness screen. So God feels the bad, the pain, the suffering, etc., that each person feels. And God puts up with that out of love in order to have this abundant possibility, future, etc. In order to give us the capacity for free will, which is necessary for love, which is necessary for more is more goodness, rather than less, or rather than static. So the alternative to an abundant potential for goodness, which is how things are, but that goes hand in hand with the possibility of waste, which we see all over the place, where bad leads to bad, and specifically believing in bad, believing that bad is good, leads to good. Again, the possibility of bad goes along with the possibility of abundance, of more is more. The potentiality for bad is like necessary to have the potentiality for abundance. The alternative would be static. And there could be like a static amount of goodness. It would be like a drug-induced bliss, sort of metaphorically or whatever, just to picture it a little bit. That's obviously not the way things are. And so what we have is better than that, but not necessarily right this minute. But the overall creation of existence and how things are is better news even than the idea of just experiencing bliss for the rest of our lives, for the rest of our existence. So infinite extreme bliss, an infinite extreme blissful state, is literally not even as good as the overall existence that we live in. Like your overall existence is basically going to be better than an extreme constant bliss. It's that great. So however bad things might look in the moment, I'm not saying they do or don't, but at any moment, regardless of the time in history, right? Any song from any era, and of course, songs that we know are mostly modern-ish era, but you know, they're all like, oh, the world's going to heck, you know, there's wars and there's problems, right? So it always seems like there's problems. But and there are. I'm saying that there are, but it might not be particularly bad now or whatever. Anyhow, but literally, the news about existence is so good that it's better than pure unlimited bliss. Not unlimited, but goes on and on and on. Unlimited, yeah, like unlimited in time. God could just create beings that existed in a blissful state. And what God created for us is even better than that. And God suffers through the meantime while we don't seek, or now hopefully do seek. And many people listening to this were seeking in their own way. That's why they're interested. So I'm not judging other people seeking or not. But that's the way things are, that it's better actually than that. Overall, the universe we live in, God isn't deceived, so God didn't mess that up. Furthermore, so we need to, this is why I don't want anyone to suffer, ever, right? I don't want my worst enemy to suffer, especially not long-term, right? Now, just like I might do something that I don't feel like doing because I don't have all my ideas aligned yet with what I feel like doing and what might be good for the future, et cetera, then there might be things that might be necessary temporarily that might lead someone to suffer, right? We might not be able to fulfill every desire of our child, or we might need to stop somebody from doing something very destructive, right? And we might need to stop them in a way that's very destructive to their body or causes them pain or whatever. But what we don't ever want to do is cause them pain for the sake of doing so, right? Or cause any suffering for the sake of that, for any sense of justice or whatever, right? Any kind of satisfaction. We don't want to get, to the extent that we get any sort of temporary satisfaction from that, that's a misalignment of our mind, just the same as if we don't feel like doing something that we affirm is good for us that we need to do, right? Then realistically, that might be the case where we might get a sense of pleasure out of seeing certain people suffer, right? Just like we might not want to do something that we also affirm is good for us, right? But that's a misalignment of our ideas. And when we see that, we don't want to agree that it should stay that way. That's what it means to not agree that bad is good, right? You might need to act however you need to act in the moment. You might need to do something you don't feel like doing. You might just notice that you feel kind of happy that someone else is suffering, a specific person, right? I doubt that people listening to this webinar like enjoy the suffering of random people, but there might be, particular enemies or people that really wronged you or other people in your estimation, and you might get a sense of pleasure out of seeing them suffer. Again, that's similar to any other misalignment. You don't need to feel guilt, but what you should not do is rubber stamp that or agree that that's enough understanding, right? It doesn't necessarily mean either that you need to prioritize figuring it out this moment. Maybe there's other important things you need to address first in your life for whatever reason, right? But you just want to keep it open and realize that you don't understand enough yet. If you don't like doing something that you also think is good for you, there's something you don't understand enough yet, right? And if we ever feel like we want someone to suffer, there's something we don't understand enough yet. God never wants us to suffer, and also realize that anyone that suffers, even if they're super bad, so to speak, just practically simple meaning of the word bad, the kind of colloquial meaning of the word bad, they're a super bad person, then if they suffer, God's going to feel it. So you can't make anyone suffer without making God suffer at the same time, including yourself, right? So again, the answer to this is to seek to understand better. And over time, we'll understand more and more, we'll spread that understanding to other people and get ideas aligned and then we'll, figure more things out, get things better, and so forth. So that's goodness, that's infinite. Let me see if there's anything I can finally say about infinite amount. I feel like in some sense, I feel like I kind of asserted that there's no such thing as infinite amount. By the way, there's no actual continuous time or space, so to speak, in like physically in physics and so forth. I mean, they don't know that. Physicists don't know that. They wonder about it. But as God creates your consciousness screen, and as there's time in that, there's a perception of time, and then there's also an external reason for obviously everything's not happening simultaneously, right? There's a reality, there's an underlying reality to time that's part of the reasons for things, just like, whatever, like if you're just like speed, right? If you drive your car faster and smash into another car, that's different than if you drive your car very slowly and smash into another car. Let's say the car is stationary, right? So there's something to that, right? There's something there, just speed, for example. It exists in some way in the physics and reasons and so forth. We might not understand it perfectly, but it's there in some way, shape, or form. Similar, time is like that, or related, and speed actually is, right? What is it, velocity over per second, right? So it includes the idea of time. Time exists in the world of reasons. Is God outside of time? Yes and no. You as a being are outside of time in the sense that your conscious screen is not. But all this stuff is like, are you inside the universe? Not really, right? Like in a sense, your body is, and your mind is inside the universe and is inside time. Therefore, is God inside of that? To whatever, you can kind of go through some of this, right? Again, the most relevant thing is to the extent if time is, if the possible configurations of how things can be are unlimited, or even if the actual configurations of how things will be in people's consciousness screens are infinite, which it seems like they would be in the sense of your conscious screen could keep going on and on and on, then God couldn't currently be aware of all of how your conscious screen is going to be in the future, right? Plus you have free will, right? We don't have, a lot of what we think we do is a ripple effect of how things are and whether you seek, right? Like, sorry, like most of what we do, like if we knock over the salt with our elbow by accident, then did you do that or not, right? As we understand the world of reasons, or the world being made of reasons, then we can understand that better, right? There's a whole complex set of factors in whether the salt got knocked over by your elbow. And someone could say, well, you could have paid better attention, right? But then there's a whole regress of what you should have fundamentally done. At what point should you have seeked more, right? I think probably grammatically I should say sought more, but just to, coin a word or term, just to be kind of clear that I mean seeking. Where am I here? Reasons, what do you do? Again, the answer to what you do is that fundamental thing of seeking or not. And then the rest of it is ripple effects of you were born with whatever you were born with, and then there's all sorts of inputs from the environment, and the difference that you as a conscious being could make in the trajectory of your life all comes down to seeking, and all the rest of it is just sort of done for you, right? Except for the difference that you make by seeking or not. So then it becomes a little bit a matter of how you define words, or how, when you say like, well, what do you do, or what does yourself do? Yourself, when I use the word self, I'm referring to like a person's mind and body, basically, which is not quite them, but it's certainly unique to you, like related to you, and important and so forth. All right, I don't want to get too tangled up. All these things are relevant. There's just a kind of a limit to how much we want to overload ourselves with at one moment. Okay, so great. So I've generally covered these things. Again, I can always go on for longer, right? But that kind of basically covers it. Time change. Oh, it's like daylight savings or whatever the equivalent is in Europe. Okay, and welcome, Megan. Sterling says, I made my own version of Proof of God, looking a little bit different from you can see it. Oh, very cool. Okay, I'll click on that later, and then people can click on that. Anyone that wants to get into this chat, it's if you go to lawofimplication.com, that'll redirect you to our MeWe groups. You have to, if you're not signed up for MeWe, which is like a Facebook-ish type of social network, then you, but without the same censorship, then you can yeah, lawofimplication.com, sign up for MeWe, and our group is also Law of Implication, just like it is on YouTube. One word, lowercase if it matters. I don't think it matters. Law of Implication. And then I make an event for these webinars, and it's a thing you can do inside of a MeWe group, and you can look at previous events and previous event chats from when you join a group. Lauren says, thanks for taking the time to go over this with so much care this time around. It's obvious to me now that I'm bouncing in and out of thinking clearly without even realizing it. Well, that's a great thing to realize. That's just super awesome. Exactly. Great. Great. And it isn't that, in one sense, we aspire to like think clearly all the time, but you may well have a limited resource each day, so to speak, of how much you can kind of turn on your seeking, or think about things, try to like very clearly. But that resource can also replenish, right? And that way it's unlimited, and you accumulate, good. You accumulate good ideas, get rid of bad ideas, right? You slowly realize the contradictions and iron them out in your mind over time, and so you make progress that way. You can think of it like you either make progress or you kind of stay still. It's not like you go backwards. Like your life can appear to go backwards in various ways. Someone's ideas in their mind can go backwards in a sense, but by absorbing more bad ideas from around them. But if you think about it this way, your mind kind of follows the track it would go on just by default, given the environment that you're in from when you were born and so forth, right? It's like yourself, your mind and body would follow a certain track. And if you think of that as kind of the baseline or the default, then that's going to have, good and bad, right? Ideas mixed together and so forth, good and bad, valued experience and so forth. And again, that's like a default. And then all you can really do is raise yourself from that default by seeking. It's not that the goal is necessarily, or the highest form of enlightenment, in quotes, is to always be thinking philosophically every minute, always noticing every bad idea, whatever, right? Always keeping all the ideas consistent in your mind. But instead, by not rubber stamping, it's like, it isn't even that you intentionally think or even seek. Seeking itself is like one step ripple effect, one step past what you do fundamentally. What you can do fundamentally is like open the door or keep the door from closing. You see, it's like when your mind says some form of bad is good, right, necessary, etc. It's like slamming a door. And if you're like, well, no, not going to close that door, and that door remains open, then that will have a ripple effect of seeking, and then things will come up one way or the other. Your brain might work on it. There might be inputs in the environment that you notice, or anomalies you notice, whatever it might be. There's ripple effects of keeping the door open. And you don't need to hold the door open that's being closed even. You just, it's like there's no effort. You just, effort is a manifestation of internal conflict. Your power can't be stopped. Your free will is so fundamental that there's no effort or stopping to it. You don't struggle. If anything you're struggling that you seem to be struggling with is not your direct free will, because it can't be a struggle. You have that power, literally. So you just say no, don't want to close that door, and then the door remains open, and then you get what you get over time. Like you get good stuff from having that door open. The seeking happens from the door being open. Mahai says, can we talk about the practicality of this, the real benefits, the applications to our lives? Because it feels to my mind that, okay, I agree, but nothing else. Well, really, I think it relates to what I just said about the door being open. The ripple effects of understanding that God exists. I mean, there might be different decisions that you make when you realize you don't want anyone to suffer. It might really help relationships because, it can just easily come up in relationships. Even people you like and feel like you love and so forth, moments can come up where you feel like, yeah, I want them to suffer. Like, you realize that God's aware of their consciousness screen. If this gives a backdrop, I mean, there's two thises. There's the overall, I covered some important foundation that, of course, is going to have a ton of practical ripple effects about consciousness screen and thinking clearly and so forth. In terms of actually knowing that God exists, it provides a backdrop in so many ways. I agree that it won't necessarily help you with your practical bottlenecks that might be currently in front of you. It might, but it might not. It's a little bit like asking, I don't see how controlling the corners of the Othello board immediately helps me have more, let's say you're playing white in Othello, just to be racist, for a moment. But if you are playing whatever color in Othello, then controlling the corners might not immediately lead to you having more of your color, on the board, but the ripple effects will be there. So that's a little bit metaphorical explaining that. How did it affect me? You'll stop misleading other people when they, or you'll be a positive force on other people when they're understanding about God. There's something about this world and the imperfection of this particular, when I say this world, like this particular universe, this particular Earth and so forth, and the rest of the universe around it, doesn't need to be this way, right? It seems to kind of be inherently have more problems just based in physical stuff than needed. And so some of realizing this is there can probably be a different nature of physical reality, a different, better universe event once it's no longer necessary. So some of this can be long-term realizing this. But there's probably a number of practical benefits realistically in terms of calm confidence in life in a certain way. Like having a sense that, okay, life is not choreographed. You can avoid a bunch of mistakes like thinking that God upholds karma, and that also you want to get justice. Like wanting to get justice can kind of derive from this as well, and that can interfere with your ability to make money. You'll often be confronted with, do I do something that's going to help me, my business, or do I, get justice here in some way, shape, or form? But maybe give it time and see, and I'll be interested to see what you discover over time. But I think, and you may well also, I think you have given it time too. You probably heard me talk about this before, Mahai, right? And so Yeah. I don't know that I have time particularly here. Like, I don't know if you're specifically a Christian as well. I think seeking to follow Jesus matters a lot too, practically speaking, because Jesus taught a lot of stuff and had a character and a reality. Just even reading Jesus's, like the Gospels, can be pretty just impactful for your day-to-day life. Rather than me getting a lot into um, why I think that Jesus was divine, essentially God. Uh, uh, I have mainstream Christian views about Jesus just to be simple to avoid misunderstandings of what I might be saying. But like Jesus himself had to use metaphors because, like when he was talking to Jewish people, they only have the concept of Yahweh, of like one God, like what we think of as in some Christianity as the God the Father, right? Or actually, Jesus just directly talked about God the Father. Um, so they didn't have a concept of like Son of God, Son of Man, the Word, that sort of thing. And so um, Jesus, like he used the phrase Son of Man, referring to Daniel's prophecy in the book of Daniel, and um, and then he also used Son of God, and then he also did things that were clearly divine, where they needed um, uh, he would teach in like temple, and he would teach Jewish people uh, on his own authority, and clarify and basically change certain teachings. Like when Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, then that was essentially overriding what they thought. And you couldn't do that in that culture. You can't do it in this culture very well either, but you couldn't do that like that. That's claiming to be divine, basically, if you talk that way, because only God could say something like that. Anyway, so Jesus, I'm talking about that isn't proof of that Jesus was God, that Jesus claimed to be divine, but when we it makes Jesus relevant to think about, and if you do delve into it, the reality that I've seen from people that don't believe in Jesus as essentially God, um, or as divine or Son of God, etc. The is that they dismiss Jesus kind of out of hand. Uh, Again, in practice, like if you talk to someone that's not a follower of Jesus, then they this is not a proof either. I'm just talking here for a second. They don't have. It's not like they have a comprehensive set of reasons why they don't. They just kind of don't. A little bit analogous to my understanding of or belief about Muhammad, right? I don't really have a comprehensive set of reasons. It's just kind of like there's not like it doesn't seem like there's a ton of good reasons, to believe that Muhammad was divine, including Muhammad. I mean, Muhammad himself just apparently claimed to be a prophet or whatever. But it isn't like there's a bunch of people running around with good reasons for not believing that Jesus was divine. So like there aren't really two sides of an argument. Like when it comes to creation and evolution, then there's proponents of evolution that at least give arguments, even if they're ultimately nonsense if you understand them. But there's still books written, When it comes to Jesus, there really isn't a lot, as far as I'm aware, of like stuff against it. And the stuff is really a very kind of pathetic attempt. And then if you do look into the what went on with Jesus, like there was a title of one book by Josh McDowell, which is kind of an apt title, which is Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which is a good way to put it, because with Jesus, you had these prophecies. There were so many prophecies that the Jewish people had. They were definitely written before Jesus was born, right? The what we think of as the Old Testament as Christians was translated into Greek in like 500 BC, right before Christ. So for certain, there was stuff was written before Christ, and there's a ton of prophecies. Like they were very specific in a lot of cases. And then you have Jesus, where there was all these miracles, and one of the things that was not said by contemporaries of Jesus, including Jewish people after the fact and so forth, like the contemporary belief, as I understand it at the time, was that, well, Jesus was like a sorcerer who misled people by the branch of Jewish people that didn't follow Jesus, right? Not that Jesus wasn't thought to perform miracles and so forth. And then there's the whole thing about the resurrection, which again, the explanation at the time and to this day, as I understand it, is generally, besides a few kind of cockamamie theories, is that what was the story that was propagated? And this is not just from the Gospels, but from external sources, that while the guards were sleeping, the disciples stole the body. That isn't the kind of story that you come up with if there's like a good reason, right? Like guards who would be put to death if they fell asleep on the job. That's what would happen to guards at that time. We're just like, yeah, while we were sleeping, and again, they were sleeping. So if I said while I was sleeping, Joseph stole my TV, then someone would say, well, you were sleeping. How do you know that they stole, right? So that's just obvious. And so it's just such a silly story that the guards fell asleep and that the disciples, they saw the disciples come while they were sleeping, rolled a massive stone away without waking any of the guards, and then took a body. And then all these disciples of Jesus who had fled and denied Jesus when Jesus was killed for no reason decided to say he was resurrected, that they met him afterwards, and totally changed their whole way that they operated it. And they all except either all or all but one were killed for not their religion, but for a historical fact that they claimed was historical fact, which is that they saw Jesus resurrected. So the idea that people die for a known lie is different than dying for like a religion as like a fanatic. Anyway, if you go through, you can, I think Lee Strobel did a pretty good job with The Case for Christ. It's a pretty famous book. Then there's a book called Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison. And if you look at, again, so step one is, I think, anyone that either has a question or has no question but doesn't follow Jesus, if you look at your reasoning, there's not much of it. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying it's not like you have compelling reasons for not believing in Jesus. It's just like, well, come on, why would I think that? Is kind of what people think, as far as I can tell from talking to people. And then so you just kind of assume that there isn't a ton of incredibly compelling reason to. And it was also clear that Jesus claimed to be divine, basically claimed to be God, which immediately leads one to understand that if he wasn't God, he would be a lunatic. And yet there's very reliable histories of Jesus that were written. There's a ton of manuscripts from a very short time after Jesus's life, which is totally different than any other document that is taken for granted to be accurate in history. And so very reliable, the accounts of what Jesus said. And so we have a pretty an account that's way more reliable than any other historical figure and anything like in history, like any kind of ancient history. And you don't have a picture of someone that's anywhere near insane, which is odd. And then and so if you look at it all just kind of in a fresh way, it may well be very compelling. It's not the kind of thing you can prove absolutely, but I think you can get to where it's overwhelmingly reasonable to follow Jesus as God, basically. And that has a number of practical ripple effects too, because Jesus had actual teachings, and there's an overall sense when you read the Gospels, it's kind of powerful. So it's part of. And someone had asked that in the comments on YouTube for me to explain why I believe in Jesus. That's a bit of an overview. I think other people have done a great job with that, and any job I did would just be kind of repeating what they said. It's not. So I can just kind of refer you to that. Roberto says, in conversations with non-believers about God, I found David's distinction on the physical world versus God, conscious screen reasons to be massively helpful in starting at the right place to build from. Otherwise, if you stick with the real world as primary, we're building from the wrong place, and almost right away we're met with conflict. There is no room for discussion until and unless two or more people are on the same page about what they're talking about. In essence, we have to start by addressing Bertrand Russell's premise issue before continuing any practical. Exactly right. That's awesome. Yeah, you see this in practice, and I see the same thing in practice, and that's why I kind of figured out this proof of God back in my mid 20s, and I'm 48 now. But then had to hone more and more about kind of getting the in practical, in practice, talking to people, having a better and better sense of the foundation of thinking and existence and such. Dave says, is there anything we particularly need to address or figure out about the defense against the defense? Dave's referring to how I started my alchemy series, which I need to still get on YouTube, where in essence people are arrogant and they feel like if they feel like attacked if their ideas are attacked, right? If they're the idea of being wrong about something that's at all something that people feel like is important to their intelligence or their sense of self-worth or whatever, then people feel like that's their ideas, that people identify with their mind, and therefore they identify with wrong ideas in their mind, and therefore correcting a wrong idea or attempting to feels to someone like an attack, like a moral attack or an actual attack on themselves, and they want to defend that. And so, and they want to even defend against the idea that they're defending, right? Like they're arrogant about being arrogant. And so obviously, if you think about it, right, the ideas that the wrong ideas in your own mind are the wrong ideas that are hurting you the most, right? Even more so generally than wrong ideas in other people's minds. And so those are the ideas we would least want to defend, and anyone trying to help us iron out wrong ideas in our own mind would be helping us the best, in the best way possible. But of course, we feel like that person's, attacking us typically. Dave says it seems we can be occluded from even seeing a defense is there in the first place. Yeah, I agree. I mean, dealing with the fact that people feeling attacked, dealing with people's is arrogance about being arrogant, right? It's like they protect their arrogance with another layer of arrogance, is the difficult part. It's kind of the basic bottleneck that we have to deal with in trying to spread good ideas. And I am always trying to understand how to do that better, and I only have a quite limited understanding of how to do that. My one idea is we're kind of snowball by, in reality, the people that we get through to are the people that were closest to this, that were speaking pretty decently in the first place, right? But a good thing about understanding how to know that God exists is that when you come across people who are seeking, instead of shutting them down like a lot of, for example, Christians do, by saying, oh, well, you just have to have faith, or by faith, or you have to have the gift of faith, or well, you can't know, or sure, we're a religion, but so is science, or so is evolution, all the stuff that amounts to you can't really know that God exists. You have to have faith. It's a gift of faith. Because of revelation from God. In other words, you have to believe the Bible first in order to believe that God exists, which is kind of an odd circular lift, right? And besides, it's incorrect. Like no revelation can be foundational. God can't appear in any way to you in a way that, it could be very compelling. If God wanted to be super compelling, God could. That would kind of basically erase your free will. But still, no matter what vision you see from God talking to you, you still don't know that the vision is correct. If you think about it, you can feel very powerfully that it's correct if God appears powerfully and incredibly enough. But it still could just correctly cause you to question your sanity or something. Like basically no amount of revelation, like direct talking from God, can be the foundation for our knowledge. It still has to be thinking consistently based on our consciousness screen, as I've done. Jarvis says, there's so much value in this topic, but after going over this series multiple times, I finally got clarity on the importance of better understanding the method. Now I'm going back through Alchemy and the LOI Explained series. Great, yeah. So it's hard, right? Like if all we had was this series, then it very much might not be enough for people, right? Like, which is why I talk, basically do more and more webinars. And I've done other series, the Law of Implication Explained, right? And the Law of Implication Explained series, which I need to make a specific playlist for that on YouTube. Hopefully I'll do that in the next day or two. But it is kind of good, not as necessarily the first thing that you hear from me, although anything can work, right? Learning happens in layers, like I talked about earlier in this series. It doesn't really matter where you start, except for like psychologically, in terms of some series might be easier to keep listening to than others, just when someone's new. But yeah, like it all kind of not just reinforces the other, but you kind of need other series, like wherever you start, you then need some other stuff, right? And so I try to keep covering stuff and get to it all. I don't know it all either. Not only do I not know, obviously no one knows it all when it comes to how things are all configured, right? Obviously I don't know how many people are in Paris right now, but in addition to that, I don't even have clarity on, all the critical foundational ideas necessarily, or almost certainly, right? I still trying to figure certain things out and so forth. I don't have in mind a perfect way to concisely tell you what I'm trying to figure out at the moment, but there's important questions that I still work on. Dave also said one other thing. How can we get rid of internal conflict completely and totally? Dropping the goal to feel certainty. Yeah, I mean, you start with not thinking with if there's internal conflict, some door needs to be open, right? Like I said, there's somewhere where you don't need to feel guilty. Like your mind is configured the way it is, just like your whole life is configured the way it is, just like your body is the way it is, based on you were born, there was the environment, there was your mind, but their mind came from the environment and where you're born, and it developed based on the environment, right? Like I said, it all kind of happens by default. And then there's flaws, and then it's like, well, how do you work out the flaws? And you keep ending up with the same answer, which is seeking, but the seeking is still one step of ripple effect. You don't directly seek. Seeking happens for you, right? Most everything is done for you. That's another practical benefit in a certain sense, or close to a practical benefit, like a couple of logical steps from a benefit is realizing, Mahai and others, how much in life, in business and so forth, is default moving forward. Like it's happening kind of automatically, in a sense by luck, because you're not aware of it all, and it's a whole complex set of reasons that whether it's your own mind or the external environment, your mind itself came essentially from the external environment, right? And what we can do is interfere in just this one way that can kind of move things towards good off of wherever it would have been normally. But seeing so much of what happens in life as external to ourselves, and in that way luck, can help us to develop strategies and approach life in a way that tries to harness that, because it's based on reality. You're kind of making your plans and your things based on how reality really works, which is like this default that's not in our control, except what's in our control is this bit of steering that we can do, or that even the steering even happens, so much happens for us. And kind of realizing that we don't directly do so many things that we think we directly do, it lets us relax in a certain way. It lets us stop judging others in a certain way. It lets us stop judging ourselves in a certain way. Stopping to judge ourselves and others also kind of go hand in hand logically, so that when you do one less, you do the other less. That can free up energy and internal conflict, which can free up energy day to day, right? Like emotional energy. A lot of the sapping of our energy and day-to-day practical stuff is internal conflict, which is rooted in judging ourselves, if you think about it. It's rooted in it. There's still, like David's saying, there can be things that you don't feel like doing and that you kind of have to do them anyway. But even that can be dissolved in a certain way. Again, we're limited on time here, but internal conflict. Oh, and then judging others will have all kinds of practical. It's like shooting a little, like a bullet or like a ding in our relationships every time we're judging other people, or if we're continuously doing so. It's like this constant dings, like injuries to our relationships, and that can affect our money making in so many ways. Which then, our money making is a very practical, major part of our lives. Our lives kind of come down to our quality of our personal relationships and our quality of our business relationships, and then that, both is quality of life in our personal relationships, and then money, which is a major part of our quality of life, unless you have some way out of that, which I'm just saying if you do, but just otherwise by default, money is going to matter, right? So if you have some way that it doesn't matter for you, then that's great, but by default, it basically does realistically. So that's that. Roberto says, David, your original yarn ball rubber band ball with the center as the answer. Oh yeah. Wait, yeah, like the snowballing, the gravitational model for how to save the world, right? Is as we get our own ideas right, then we end up gravitating people that are closer to having their ideas right, kind of to us. And as you have more, it's like more gravity. You get the people, the next batch that's closest, and so forth. And then there's more people, more good ideas, more communication of good ideas. And so there's more of a gravitational pull. Then you get kind of the next closest people, and so forth. So when we, in day-to-day life, we encounter a lot of people that are not very close. And so it can feel like, oh, this is really difficult. But it's a little bit like in business, right? Like with my business where I made most of my money with what was called OMG machines. In day-to-day life, if I would encounter someone, mostly they wouldn't want to buy our, $5,000 or $8,000 coaching program, right, for how to make money online and do search engine optimization and so forth. So it might seem like, well, how can I make money doing this? But instead, of course, we got our leads of people that were kind of close and interested in that. Right, and same with almost any business, right? There's a narrow set of prospective customers, prospects that are kind of close or want what you have ideally, right? And then you want to reach those people, but then that can create a snowball effect, right? Like even if we think of Facebook, which in a certain way is a massive success, right? In terms of just its growth and its reach and its power, right? Obviously the way that it went ideologically and anti-free speech and censorship. About things we know are false now, like Hunter Biden's laptop and such, is terrible. But its success in terms of just getting a ton of users was huge, and it would have snowballed from people that were early adopters and then going from there, right? So I love what you wrote. I didn't read the whole thing here because we're just about out of time. And then the final thing I'll address here. My question is a couple things. My question with Jesus is, why is there not a modern day version, considering that humanity clearly does not take what happened back then seriously today? Well, a lot of humanity takes it pretty seriously. Like, there's a fairly large, given it as one guy, right? Pretty amazing amount of followers today still. I don't know, we can come up with stuff like, well, why couldn't Jesus have done even more, basically, like if you look at kind of the root of what you're asking, right? Why can't Jesus appear in more different places right? You have an interesting way that God seems to have chosen to do it, where there was a person, Abraham, and then he had a bunch of descendants that were seen as one group of people, right? The Israelites. And so it was really through one guy, that Jesus decided, I'm going to intervene in history. I'm talking about how the story goes, and I affirm that I think this is, I conclude or calculate that this is correct, but I'm not, this isn't a proof. I'm just kind of going through how the history goes. But if you look at how it went, and there were this amazing, incredible amount of prophetic stuff pointing to Jesus. So God tried and God was thinking, in one sense, there was this idea of through Abraham reaching people, but then that was limited in how effective it was. And so, I mean, Jesus told this as a parable, right? In terms of, Jesus said there was a guy who owned a vineyard and he rented it out to tenants. And then when time came to collect the rent, he sent a representative to go collect the rent, and they beat up the representative and said, no, we're not going to pay. And then he sent another one, another one, another one. And so finally he said, I'll send my son. And this is the last I'm going to send. And then he said, but then the tenant said, well, this is great. This is the last guy he's going to send, so we'll beat him up and kill him. We'll actually kill this one, and then we'll be free of having to pay the rent. So God, according to the history, sent a whole bunch of prophets to Israel to get them on the right path, to be sort of like Jesus to the world, right? To spread a communication and to serve as a certain type of example, metaphorically, right? There's a whole bunch of metaphors in what the Jewish people were told to do, right? The rules don't make sense unless you understand them as being metaphorical, right? Like animal sacrifice and ritual cleaning and all sorts of stuff, even the Sabbath and all that. It's a metaphor to try to communicate ideas to people, in essence. And then, but then the final idea is God's son, and that was the last one. So Jesus kind of gave Jesus's own story to kind of make sense out of what you kind of just said there. And then but there was a massive process involved in Jesus coming to earth. It's not just that Jesus was like, here I am, here's a bunch of miracles, I'm God, believe in me. And so to repeat that is basically, and somehow in God's judgment also, is unnecessary. Now, if we need to realize what we're talking about here on this series of webinars on the law of implication, understand about God, understand about seeking, then that can be enough to get to everyone. If we can do it, which I think we can and will over time, I think we'll spread these ideas because these ideas can't lose. They always defeat wrong ideas or fuzzy ideas, right? Blurry, wrong ideas. So I think we'll keep advancing with this understanding. And then that will take care of things. And if that's the case, then Jesus was enough to catalyze the process of continuing. So that's another thing. Do I think that someone needs to know about and believe in Jesus in that sense, in the sense of knowing Jesus as a historical figure and saying, I pray you into my heart, or I believe in you, or please save me? Do I think people need to do that, not to go to hell or something? I don't have that. There's flaws in, that isn't my view of things. I don't think there will be such a thing as God causing people to suffer forever with no chance of getting out of that. I've talked about that in the past. Haven't really dealt with that a lot here. But that's just importing stuff that I haven't talked about and I don't affirm. That doesn't line up with how God would have to act, not being not deceived. So I think that's a misinterpretation. I don't understand exactly what Jesus meant by some of the things in like the later verses of Matthew, for example, talking about the end times and so forth. But anyway, that's that. You're very welcome, Jarvis, for saying I can't thank you enough for doing this work. I better, I can kind of wrap this up now, and then people can ask questions, as I said, here in the YouTube comments and such, and as those, if and as those accumulate, I can make like a recording or do a webinar where I'm addressing those. And I'm always addressing those over time, even, so I'll do further topics, of course, and keep talking and doing webinars. And so as I do whatever topic, it'll all kind of be about the same cluster of ideas, you know, so it'll end up further clarifying things. It's always, you know, it's generally an ongoing process. You're very welcome, Danusia. You've come across a vast body of knowledge yourself and others might be interested in too. You'll share soon. Okay, great. The MeWe group is perfect for that. So dropping judging others and ourselves can help getting rid of guilt, shame, and also internal conflict. Yes. Yeah, accept that there's wrong ideas. The more you understand the idea of luck and things external to you, and drop thinking that you do this, you do that, when your body does it, and your body comes from luck, basically. That doesn't absolve you of a person of responsibility if they like do something to somebody. But we're ultimately, it comes down to seeking, and we're going to be flawed, and we have bad ideas in our mind and contradictions, and we want to resolve those and figure them out over time, and then you know, go from there. Great. Awesome, Eric. Thank you very much for what you wrote. Okay, guys, thank you tremendously for your live participation now and in the past and in the future. And we will always continue. Thank you. You're very welcome, Megan, who says you always give so much to zoom in on to clarify fuzzy thoughts more and more. You're very welcome. You're welcome. Hi. Thanks again. Thanks for your question or questions, and thanks, Lawrence. We made it, everyone. This is great. You're awesome. We did it. Yeah, this is exciting because now it's up on YouTube, which again, very flawed in terms of their censorship and ideology. Not a big fan, but realistically, we're reaching people. And you know, let's say I was doing an interview on a radio show, we could say, well, there's been bad stuff on radio, you know, or the company that owns the radio station does bad stuff, but we want to reach people. So great to have it on YouTube. I'll certainly look to have it on other platforms as well over time. But it's great to have it on YouTube, and the more you can support the endeavor on YouTube currently, the better. Again, it only helps to reach people rather than not reach them. And we have the MeWe group people can get over to, so that if I'm ever censored off of YouTube, then we can regroup easily to other places, and I'll proactively be at other places as well that are less prone to censorship. You're welcome, Hung. Thanks, David, for explaining God's existence. This year I understand better about LOI. My life also gets easier. Maybe I just got lucky. I love it. That's pretty funny, but I'm glad to hear that. And it should. I mean, things get easier. Of course, by luck, things can, you know, whack you in life. You know, even if you're seeking but you get unlucky, you can have a net, you know, negative in terms of just practical stuff in life. You know, your money or a relationship could get destroyed, or someone could even pass away, God forbid, and so forth. But overall, you'll be making true progress. Thanks for getting the replays up quickly lately. I'm like a teenager waiting for the next phone, waiting that next to the phone for a call. I love that. That's really great. I'll get it up today again, unless some crazy thing happens. But I'll, including me just weirdly zoning out and forgetting somehow. But I'll look to get it up right away on YouTube. I appreciate that, Mahai. Life becomes so much nicer when better thoughts disappear when sticking to David. So yeah, it's almost like whatever benefits you realize from LOI are kind of a bit of an answer to your question about what's the practical benefit of believing in God. It all kind of fits together, you know. Does anyone have access to something called Endgame that David recorded about success in romantic relationships? Mike Long has the first one. I don't know if the rest is lost to antiquity or not. So I'll look to do. I'm definitely going to do a topic sub-series on relationships and try to be comprehensive about that. I know people have said they're looking forward to that. So that's good. I might do evolution next just to kind of stick with this topic, and then do relationships after that, and then other topics. But we'll see exactly. Awesome. You're welcome, Dave. And then if you reach out to Mike Long, he could probably get you the at least the first video of After Game. People say they like that one still. I recorded that about 17 years ago. It was the first year. It was when I got married the first year, but it wasn't about me being married. It was ideas I had prior to getting engaged and married. But it turned out that my marriage worked out very well. Certainly some imperfections in how I've acted, and we had to work through some things and had a challenge, especially with our child being born in that first year and so forth. I don't want to sugarcoat things or act like I walk on water. I for sure don't. But my understanding about relationships, both in general and then romantic relationships, I think can benefit people tremendously. Okay, guys, I will talk to you all soon. Look forward to it.